What in the world? Rebecca shouted as she started trying to pull at the chain that led into the ground at her feet. Again and again, trying to step away, pull at it with her hands and her feet. Trying to lift as hard as she could, but getting absolutely nowhere with it. That was not coming up. Why won't it lift? Rebecca shouted. Oh, I replied. Well, that's because I anchored you. You see, that teleportation of yours allows you to transport yourself, right? And all your clothes and all that type of stuff goes along for the trip. But I took a wild guess and assumed that there'd be some limitations to it. For example, being able to teleport large amounts of other things. I essentially created an anchor for you. That chain leading into the ground actually spreads out, gathering all the ground around your feet. It was somewhat like a container of sorts. I had to make it extremely thin on the sides, but it doesn't have to withstand impacts. So the fact that it's thin doesn't really matter. Essentially, I made the entire space you're standing in a massive brick, and then strapped you to it. That doesn't make any sense, Rebecca shouted. You never threw any of that liquid steel stuff at me. Before realizing, as her eyes widened and she looked down at the chain going into the ground. You trickster! That anchor thing, it was really just an excuse for you to put that liquid steel into the ground, and then somehow you burrowed it over to me, didn't you? That's a sneaky trick, Rebecca shouted. Yeah, I know, but it did work. While you were watching me running around dodging the rainbow strips, I separated the bottom about 1/4 of the liquid steel that I put into the heavy metal anchor and forced it to drill its way over to you, nice and quiet, where you wouldn't notice it. The last part of the ground, I actually had to liquefy the steel, force it to seep its way through rather than drill. I didn't want to take the chances that those vampire senses of yours would notice the vibrations of drilling. But you gave me plenty of time to do it, so I was able to coalesce your little chain there and attach it to the anchor without much of an issue, I said, as all the rainbow strips continued to coalesce, being pulled by my heavy metal thread, wound in like fish on a hook, heading towards the central anchor. But that's not all I did either. What? Rebecca shouted, looking over in my direction, beginning to grow ever more concerned. Yep, it's not over yet. My unseen performance still has more to it, I said, as a large ring of dust kicked up behind me, forming a massive circle around the heavy metal anchor, drawing a very defined circular line about 20 feet wide, circling the anchor, and a liquid steel bar began to form right behind me, a handhold of sorts. You see, Rebecca, I also extended the range of this anchor in the same way that I did the one holding you, creating essentially a very large brick, or you might say, a boulder. Imagine a bowl, then fill that bowl with dirt, and pack it down nice and tight. Then all you have to do is make that bowl about 20 foot wide. My liquid steel is the bowl, and the dirt you see here behind me is the dirt in it. Essentially, it's just a big rock with a coat of my liquid steel under it. For ease of handling, you could say, I shouted as I turned around, grabbing hold of the liquid steel bar protruding from the ground, and began to lift with all of my might. As the rainbow strips finally coalesced, the spool stopped spinning, no more room left. Countless dozens of rainbow strips, all caught in a massive tangle of heavy metal wire, pinned to the center of this bowl. Those rainbows ebbing out in every direction, but all still pinned to the center of it. I even started focusing. My muscles alone weren't gonna do this. That's why I incorporated the heavy metal steel. I'm gonna need both of them. I gave it every ounce of focus I could, no longer having to keep the spool spinning. I forced it to lift. With my body and my mind, that 20-foot chunk of earth started to raise from the ground. Small bits of dirt and debris falling from the sides as I lifted it out of place. A massive chunk of ground, and with every bit of mental and physical might I had, bending down, lifting with my arms, my legs, everything, I lifted that 20-foot slab of dirt, hurling it over my head, back behind me, towards Rebecca. The steel holding all the dirt in place allowed me to control it. Not 100%, but it allowed me to keep adding force to it as it began to fly in her direction. The whole thing probably looked pretty damn impressive. Rebecca was waiting for a show, and she got one. Chained to the ground watching that boulder flying in her direction. But I definitely think I pulled a few muscles, lifting that thing out of the ground. My legs and my arms were killing me, if not from the running around, and from the exertion of having to try to lift that thing. Even adding in the mental force of being able to control the liquid steel, it still felt like trying to bench press a school bus, or deadlift it, however you call it. But it all worked out. This was game over. I win. I thought as I finally turned around, watching that boulder with all of those rainbow strips attached to it flying in her direction. Rebecca grit her teeth as she stood to her feet. "No way!" she shouted as that pink aura lit itself back up again, forming around her body as a gust of wind burst out from where she stood, pointing at the giant boulder flying in her direction and whirling that finger. "Minasora Astosa, Maxi Maximize," she shouted out as a pink glow began to encompass the boulder, and suddenly its progression began to slow. It was almost right on top of her, but now it was slowing to a halt with that flow of pink aura and wind flowing out from her. Damn it, I thought to myself, this is not good. That was my game winner, and she's stopping it. No way, I thought to myself, raising my hand, forcing the liquid steel that formed the bowl that boulder was covered in to begin gathering in 4 points on the bottom. I focused hard, creating what it amounted to turbines, like you might find in a jet engine, and with all the force I could muster, forced them into a rapid spin. Suddenly, massive gusts of air propelled out of them, beginning to force the boulder back down in Rebecca's direction. And suddenly, it became a conflict of magical power versus telekinetic ability. Me forcing it towards her, and her trying to force it right back. Even the rainbow strips started to join in, pulling back the opposite direction, trying to pull the boulder away from Rebecca. As wind clashed and flowed out in both directions, me using both the turbines and my own telekinetic force, and her using magic, pushing it back and forth. in a battle of wills.